Let's talk about electric vehicles. I know you love talking about electric vehicles. I love talking about electric vehicles because we hate them. And once again, another study has proven exactly this. Now, the study comes to an interesting conclusion, which I will get to in a minute. But what they're basically suggesting, this is from Monash University's Climate Works Centre, is that if we want to reach our 2030 emissions targets, which of course Peter Dutton has said if he was Prime Minister he would scrap and ignore. If we want to reach that target, we need 73% of all new vehicles sold in this country by 2030 to be electric. Now, that is simply not going to happen. And I will remind you that the federal government, before it was the federal government, when it was still in opposition, forecast, in order to boost its likelihood of reaching these 2030 targets, that 89% of vehicles sold in this country by 2030 would be electric. The Federal Transport Department now says it will be something like 27%. So they're kind of losing out on that. If we had just 56% of vehicles sold in this country being electric by 2030, we would still miss our transport emission goals by 21%. I mean, you might look at that, I look at that and go, well, surely that means that the target is just a load of bunkum, it's never going to happen. Well, Monash University says there is another solution, which is basically give up your car entirely. If we can't have EVs, just don't drive at all. They have suggested that, basically we're putting all our eggs in one basket talking about EVs. And the problem is not so much that, we should be moving to EVs, which means you keep driving as much as you are now. No. It's much more complex than that. Get rid of your car, get on public transport. Don't get on a plane, they say. Use a train instead. Don't use a truck to transport cars, cars as well, but cars and food and whatever around the country. Use rail instead. Isn't it funny? This is where we're going. EVs are a great idea, fantastic, environmental panacea. Now they've worked out that ain't going to work. So why do we need cars at all? Just get on the bus, you bludger.
Well, this is straight out of the Climate Communism Handbook that Joe doesn't believe in, even though we've constantly got proof of it staring in our faces. But look, the EV take-up has slowed very fast here in Australia. In April, for the first time in over 3 years, it was down just 5%. Now, that's not huge, but they're predicting that this is just going to keep tanking. Tesla alone, also in April, their sales were down by 44%. And this is
because Elon Musk bought Twitter. He's not cool anymore. All the virtue signalers are like, oh my God, no, he lives in free speech.
This is despite all the retailers heavily discounting their EVs. They're trying to, make them much cheaper, make them much more attainable for people. But the thing is, other than the resale value diving, so people are like, this is not a wise investment, the government, instead of having rebates, instead of having any kind of tax incentives, simply needs to build the infrastructure, which they have failed to do so terribly. You can't encourage people to buy cars if there aren't available chargers ready to go, and that's to put all the other problems aside. But what incentive right now do people have in terms of when am I going to be able to fuel up? It's dismal in this country.
Unless, of course, you live in the city. It's the only situation where an electric car kind of makes sense. But it blows the whole thing out of the water. And because there are lots of people driving EVs around, which are powered fundamentally by coal-fired power, particularly in a state like Queensland or New South Wales. They can feel so virtuous about it. But they're driving around thinking they're doing their bit for the planet. What Monash has uncovered is essentially that nothing is really going to be done for the planet because no one wants to buy them. They're not going to buy them the numbers they need to actually make any impact. And the chairman of Toyota said back in January, and I mean, look, he's in the business of selling cars. He is the chairman of one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world. So if he wants to his job is to make money. He says that we'll only ever reach 30% of cars in the world being electric. The rest will be made up by hydrogen and hybrid, basically, right? Because there are lots of parts of the world that don't actually have access to power all the time. They're not going to be using EVs. So everyone in the sector knows it and says it. Monash University says it ain't working. Why do we keep going down this road?
Because the climate debate has been hijacked by ideologues for whom the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Maybe?
Climate communists, if you will. I would call them climate ideologues. But yes, they despise gas, which all the smart people in the debate see as a really important component, at least as we transition to renewables. Yep. So at least for the next, 5, 10, whatever years. And yet you've got people saying gas is just as bad as coal. That is a lie. That is just incorrect. That is just unfactual. That is a bare-faced, bald-faced, provable, demonstrable lie. Trust the science. And so you have people like that. And the same sort of people obviously will not even talk about nuclear, will not even allow it to enter the discussion, which I think is foolish. I'm not sure if it economically stacks up at the moment, but it may well in the future, and it should be on the table. And they also have the same approach, of course, to hybrid cars. So a car that burns any fuel at all ever is persona non grata. And the problem with that, of course, is that there are heaps and heaps of... That creates, obviously, shrinking demand, which means the car makers are less likely to make them and sell them and market them and ship them to Australia. And the problem with that is that hybrid cars actually solve 90% of the problems that people have with pure electric cars, which is range anxiety, range anxiety, range anxiety, range anxiety, range anxiety, power, and range anxiety. And so you could have like a ute, you could have like one of those big Ford Rangers that everybody loves, the most popular car in Australia. If that's a hybrid model, you don't have to worry about pulling your trailer or your caravan when you have to, because you've got the petrol there if you need it. You don't have to worry about running out if you're doing a big camping trip or whatever, not having the power, not being able to charge it up, because you've got the fuel there if you need it. So it just provides that safety net. But because you've got all these people who say, no, you can't have any petrol ever, it's all evil. Just like, no, we can't have any gas, it's all evil. Yet suddenly the Victorian government is laying for gas. And they're absolutely right that more people should be using rail, and especially goods should be using rail, not roads. And that just, everybody knows that. Everyone in the industry knows that. That's not even just a climate thing. That is just an absolute no-brainer. It's better for residents. It's more efficient. It's cheaper. But where's the rail?
Precise.
So, and again,
it's cheaper. It's cheaper if the lines exist.
That's right. And if we turn back over the page to find the Victorian government is forcing all these landlords to effectively jack up their rent so that they can make their houses more energy efficient and save the climate. And you've got Monash University in Victoria saying, well, we need to make sure there are better rail options for people so that they're not driving their cars. Well, how do you get to the airport in Melbourne?
Not via rail.
They've had an airport railing that was there on the cars, but because they so utterly effed up their COVID response, they now have no money to build that. So they're forcing people to, it's very much do as I say, not as I do. They're forcing people to bear all these costs and then pass them on to the most vulnerable people in the community, i.e. renters trying to afford a roof over their head, while at the same time they're not doing the very obvious thing that they could be doing to achieve that same goal. So, you know what, Liz? I'm going to give you 2 for 2. It's climate communism. There you go.